All right. I believe that we should be live. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the history of racism in Islam. Previously, we looked at some of the words attributed to Muhammad. If you haven't seen that show, don't worry. You don't need to see that to understand today's material. You're probably familiar with some of the things that can be interpreted as racist that Muhammad said. You probably also know that Muslims try to find ways around these. Some cases it's credible, other cases not so much. But what they definitely cannot deny is that after the time of Muhammad, there's a long history of racist thoughts in Islamic writers inspired by the words attributed to Muhammad. So we're going to be looking at those sources today and kind of seeing just how consequential the remarks of Muhammad and to a lesser extent Allah in the Quran were in Islamic history. Before we dive into the subject, let me open us with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the technology that allows us to connect with people from all around the world. People who are Christians, people who are Muslims, and people who are neither. We ask that anyone watching approach the material with an open mind and they not simply dismiss things because either they don't want to hear what we have to say or because they have different ideas that they want to hold on to. Rather, we ask that everyone seek truth wherever that may lead. We thank you that we are dearly loved children of you, no matter what our skin color may be, that you value us and you have created us in your own image. We ask that everyone watching, whether live or later on a replay, feel the love that only you can provide. We ask that you guide our discussion today and that you prevent us from theological error. We ask that you keep us calm as we look at what is often difficult material. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so I'll give a brief review of what we did last time, but before we do that, I'm joined by Lloyd de Jong and Io from the Third Apology. Do you guys have any thoughts on the previous episode?
Real quick, I'll just say that, in the previous episode, we definitely saw how it was kind of a downward slope, kind of started off a bit, at least relatively speaking, lighter, things which could be interpreted one way, could be interpreted another way. But even in our time together, and not having gone through too many sources, just the way in which we saw things progressively deteriorate was very telling. And so I'm sure we're going to see more of that today. I guess the real question is just how bad is it really going to get? And that's going to be one of the most interesting parts of all, for sure.
Any thoughts from you, Lloyd?
Um, the evidence was very on the nose last time, and it's quite obvious that this prejudice towards Black people and the fact that it's a capital crime to claim that Muhammad is Black, I think this itself is very much a substantial fact. And yeah, it's just that no matter what evidence you present, obviously Muslims will reject any and all evidence, no matter what the source, because they're not allowed to and they cannot accept anything that would impugn Islam, even if it's from their own sources and even if it's true. So I guess this evidence goes to Christians and goes to non-Muslims, and we are called upon to utilize this evidence and look at the not just the nature of it, but just the amount of it, and make a judgment. And yeah, eventually, I think that we need to be speaking about this. We need to be asking about this, and Muslims need to answer for this as to the history and nature of Islam, because they obviously deny anything and everything: Islam's slavery, Islam's prejudice against women, its violence towards women, and its violent nature, etc. Muhammad's behavior as a violent man who ordered assassinations and so on. So all of this just cumulatively, it just paints a very horrible picture of a horrible man.
Excellent. Well, not excellent then. He's horrible, but Black Horse Lover says, don't forget to like the stream to boost the algorithm. And Peter 2 Apologetics says to hit the like button like Muhammad hit Aisha. I do appreciate people doing that to help get this to more viewers. Not for my own benefit so much, but for the material getting out there. I hope that people take this material and you use this in your conversations, because in our society, Islam kind of is exempt from these race issues. They're associated with Christianity unfairly. And in fact, people all around the world have been prejudiced. And unfortunately, in Islam, it goes right back to the founder of the religion, which is not something you could say about Christianity. So take the material, use it in your conversations. People aren't going to hear this material from the school or from media or anything like that. So the only way to get it out there is to share the material. I don't care so much if you share the video, but definitely use the material. So with that said, Haja couldn't make it today, but she said that she wanted the stream or the show to go on without her. So we will welcome her back another time. We'll go ahead and bring up my presentation here. Just briefly review what we said last time. Like I said, if you didn't see that show, you can check it out later, but you don't need to see it to understand anything that we're talking about today. Kind of my thesis is that we hear often that we in the Western school system and racial sensitivity trainings at work and whatnot, we hear that racism was something that Europeans invented, especially Americans invented, to justify the slave trade and to keep lower class white people from associating with Black people, thus keeping the social structure of the elite whites in place. We started with the question of what is race. It's kind of one of these terms that we all know what it means, but it's really hard to define. So I defined race theory as these physical traits that we can observe. They correlate with other traits that we can't directly observe. And thus there is real material differences between someone with light skin and someone with dark skin, for example. We asked the question of whether race was real or not, and I suggested that it was both real and not real. It's real in that we think it is. So then because of that, we create differences in society. However, it's not real in that there's no real biological differences that equate with, say, intelligence and skin color. I talked a little bit about how we're told that race was invented in Europe, but especially in the United States due to class warfare. It's often associated with Christianity, but actually, ironically, Christianity necessitated the creation of race because Christians were saying that all people are valuable, all people are created in God's image, and the so-called scientists stepped in to fix that misconception by pointing out these so-called scientific differences, which we would now call pseudoscience, but at the time were absolutely considered scientifically correct, these supposed differences and these diseases that Black people inherently carried.
Wasn't the idea of racism actually started by one of the communists? One of the early founders of the Soviet Union?
Highly possible. So I said, remember the 1001's Inventions propaganda tour where the creators of this tour went about and said, oh, all those cool things that you like, clocks and calculators and cameras and all kinds of things. Well, those were all actually invented by Islam. Of course, the tour was just pure propaganda, But I think when we look at the evidence, we might conclude that Islam does deserve credit for the invention of racism, because in the ancient world, people certainly looked at outsiders differently than people in their own group. There's always been prejudice, but it wasn't divided on what we would now call race, these ideas primarily relating to skin color. We started with the Quran, in particular 3:106 here. We said that this passage, while it can definitely be read as metaphorical, it can also be read as racist. And I actually have a video on this passage coming out on Monday for Martin Luther King Day. We uploaded to Patreon today, and then it'll be public Monday, so be on the lookout for that. It turns out that Islamic commentators have basically always taken this as referring to skin color. Even though it's easy to read it metaphorically, they have generally taken it as referring to skin color, not necessarily in a racist way, but definitely at least referring to skin color, which creates a big problem. Even if we say that, the author isn't racist, if the author is an all-knowing God, then he should have known that this could be read as racist later on and pick some other sign to distinguish between the people, besides being white and black, colors associated with skin. He could have said purple and green or something. He wouldn't have had to pick these two particular colors. We looked at Ibn Ishaq and this famous line, "Whoever wants to see Satan, let him look at Nabtal Ibn al-Harith. He was a sturdy black man with long, flowing, inflamed arms and dark, ruddy cheeks." This is one of the people who used to say that Muhammad was just copying stories, that he was not getting real revelations, and Muhammad naturally got really angry with him and said that he looks like Satan. Now, we can say that this isn't racist on Muhammad's part, that he was actually just thinking of one particular man. The problem is he made this association, and then since Muhammad is supposed to be the perfect example for everyone to follow, later Muslims make the same association. I'll just highlight a couple of the hadith. We saw that Adam's shoulders, out of one shoulder comes a white offspring, and out of the other come black offspring, and the black offspring are described as looking like charcoal, and in the hadith it says, "To hell and I do not care." So we get, again, it could be read metaphorically, but it's really easy to read it straightforward as well and think that black people are just charcoal made for the fire. We, of course, have Muhammad describing an Ethiopian as having a head like a raisin and making other nasty descriptions of black people. In theory, right? In theory, this verse is saying that it doesn't matter what someone looks at like, but it doesn't quite live up to that, because he's trying to choose the worst example of what someone could be, and that includes being black. We saw that black people are associated with bad omens and the destruction of the Kaaba. We looked at Muhammad's farewell sermon, or so-called farewell sermon. Doesn't actually come from that text, but modern Muslims tell us that it does. And they say that somehow this trumps everything else, because these words, falsely told to be part of the farewell sermon, says that a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black any superiority over a white except by piety and good action, that somehow this trumps everything else. Of course, that doesn't really work. Even if Muhammad said these words, and of course it's highly questionable whether he said them or not, because it actually comes from a secondary hadith collection, not one of the canonical ones. It's not part of the farewell sermon. He could have said it early on. He could have changed his mind. He could have just been having a good day. But even if we take it as accurate, it still doesn't disallow for racism. All it's saying is that people will be judged by their actions by Allah, but that doesn't exclude the possibility that white people might be superior over black people in other ways, other than by their piety. So I think that is where we left off last time. I have one more hadith to look at, which leads directly into the post-Islamic sources. So I left this one for last. A slave came and pledged to the Prophet to emigrate, and the Prophet did not realize that he was a slave. Then his master came looking for him. The Prophet said, "Sell him to me," and he brought him for him 2 black slaves. Then he did not accept the pledge of anyone until he asked, "Is he a slave?" So we'll open it up for discussion with the panel now. I'll start with your thoughts, Io. What do you think about this hadith?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I think we did at least briefly touch on this one in the last stream, but I think it is still a good place to pick up. From what I remember, one of the things that I've used this verse before myself in many videos, and one of the things that had jumped out to me that I hadn't noticed at first was that the heading, if I remember correctly, for this hadith basically is titled how to decide when it comes to buying and selling and trading animals, so to speak, right? And then you have this hadith coming, I mean, directly in this section. So again, kind of one of those things where you think, man, I mean, someone really did not consider how this would look. I mean, maybe because that is how it looks, right? I mean, you have Muhammad here literally buying and trading black slaves. And so, I mean, this is obviously just the tip of the spear, but I mean, this is huge, right? Because if the shoe were on the other foot and we saw something like this from Jesus, it would be an incessant point that the world would be making against Christianity in order to discredit it. But as you said yourself at the beginning, because these sort of things just don't come under as much scrutiny with Islam, it's basically swept under the rug.
Anything you want to add, Lloyd?
Yeah, we have clear evidence Muhammad bought slaves from people who owned slaves and sold slaves. Now, we are incessantly told that Muhammad stopped slavery, it abolished slavery. Where is that written in the Islamic law? We know that they've got entire chapters on slavery and dealing with slaves, selling slaves, buying slaves, managing slaves in the Islamic law. And they'll tell us, oh, Muhammad abolished the slaves. No, Muhammad might have, no, he freed the slaves. He might have freed a slave or 2. Nowhere does it show us that he entirely freed the slaves. And of course, then you'll see, but Muslims going, well, the time it was difficult and, you couldn't just do so and blah, blah, blah. All the excuses for Islam. And then, of course, no one else gets any kind of slack, even though this is apparently okay in Islam. But also anything Muhammad did is sunnah. It must be copied by the Muslims. So if it's okay for Muhammad to buy slaves, then it's okay for all Muslims to buy slaves. Because unless you want to tell me, was Muhammad wrong for trading in slaves? And of course, no Muslim can claim Muhammad was wrong. No Muslim can claim Muhammad did anything that was wrong. So was he wrong for buying slaves? Was he wrong for having people selling slaves? Was he wrong doing any of this? And they'll make every excuse in the book.
Absolutely.
And of course, we see there that he continued to buy slaves because it says then he did not accept the pledge from anyone until he asked, "Is he a slave?" which meant that this continued.
Yeah, he was looking out for his own financial well-being there. He didn't want to accept a pledge from a slave because he might have to buy that slave if he did. Gray and Grayer says a big part of the promise of paradise is the whiteness of virgins. It's sickening, so pale that their bones are vaguely seen through. And we'll get a chance to look at a picture of Islamic paradise as we move along.
Real quick, though, something I want to add even about that comment there was that I don't remember what source I heard this from, but when you look at the Arab slave trade and what went on, they were also harvesting like white European women, and I know that was a big commodity for them as well, and they would sell them for much more because of how sought after they were. I don't know if that aspect of paradise is what maybe fueled that sort of desire, but I think it's obviously too big to just write off as a coincidence.
Indeed, that's a perfect segue into our next slide here.
If I can mention something related to the comment that was posted a moment ago. There's a term in Islamic law called hurra, Ghurra. So if someone has murdered a Muslim's family member, there must be this, there's this blood. They speak of the blood penalty. You have to pay some kind of penalty, right? There must be recompense for the murder. So hurra means that in the Arab society, in Bedouin society, you can give a virgin white girl to the family, right? So this woman, this virgin white girl, is given by the family of a murderer to a member of the injured family as compensation, in which case that family forgoes the right of vengeance. So here you've actually got the trade in white women slaves to forgo vengeance for murder.
Yeah, that's a great example.
So we have some research into the price of slaves. A Muslim might say, well, that was just what slaves cost at the time. That, Muhammad wasn't saying that a black person's only worth half that of a white person. He was just following the times. Of course, this becomes problematic because his example is supposed to be followed by all Muslims. And so if he was
If I
just
can
going
mention,
along with something, then he's kind of endorsing it. But we have some
apologies
research.
for
Go ahead.
sorry, apologies for interrupting. So we just mentioned the Houris here. The singular is hawra, right? Hawra. The plural is hur, hur, and hur actually translates as white.
Hmm.
The word hur translates as white. Now, of course, in Islamic literature, they apply it to the whites of the eyes, but this is not the actual meaning. It means to the whiteness of the skin, right? This is
Wow.
the color, the whiteness of the skin. And they speak of in eschatology, the plural hur or hur is used in the Quran for the virgins of paradise promised to the believers who have this whiteness of skin. So again, here you've got this whole issue around the women have to be white. Where are the white women at?
Yes. So when we look at the research into the actual price of slaves, we do see confirmation that white slaves were considered more valuable than black slaves. This comes from Bernard Lewis's book, Race and Slavery in the Middle East. Black slaves seem to have cost from 200 to 300 dirhams, black eunuchs at least 2 or 3 times as much. So we see that castrated slaves are worth more. There's two reasons why. One is that castration is quite dangerous. It can lead to death. So if they've already gone through that process, then they're more valuable. But why do they want their slaves to be castrated? And that's because they're constantly afraid, and we'll see this in some of the sources we go through, of the black slave having sex with their wives. So they don't want to contaminate their wives. They want to get this castrated slave instead. Black female slaves were sold at 500 dirhams or so. Trained singing girls or other performers at 10 or even 20,000. So we do see a difference between the transatlantic slave trade and the Arab slave trade. We see that they're primarily not interested in labor. There were some people put in hard labor, but they're more interested in people who can entertain them, especially sexually, as we'll see. White slaves, mainly for military purposes, were more expensive. Prices of 300 dirhams are quoted for Turks near the source of Central Asia and much higher prices elsewhere. In Baghdad, they fetched 400 or 500 dirhams, while a white slave girl could be sold for 1,000 dinars, which is about 13,000 dirhams. So
Dang.
we see that a black male slave could be 200 dirhams and a white female slave could be 13,000. So we see quite a discrepancy. The females are worth more in general, and whites are worth more than blacks.
Yeah, that's like 5 or 6 times more. It's crazy. So, I mean, excellent point about how the dynamics of who goes for how much, or what kind of person goes for how much, completely differs in comparison to the transatlantic slave trade for sure. Wow.
So we have Ultimate Liar in the chat here. He says that Monologists lying on Islam by themselves. How about you compare even your lies to the reality of your Bible? Uh, please explain how I'm lying. I'm just reading primary sources here. Everything that I'm going to have today, so this one technically is research, a summary of research, but just about every slide is a direct quote from a primary source, which apparently means I am lying. Very
Yeah, but
interesting stuff.
don't forget the way Muslims, this is, even though they deny the Sharia, within the Sharia, anything that someone says that would cause doubt in a Muslim must be vilified as lies, and the person speaking must be vilified as a liar, even if what they say is true, because that is slander in Islam. Don't forget that is ghibba. So slander is to speak the truth that is embarrassing to Islam, something that wouldn't want known, and any doubt must be attacked immediately as lies and the speaker as a liar, even if the source is true. So this is he's following the Sharia to the letter.
So we've seen the price of slaves. We also have some research about the status of black slaves. Again, from Bernard Lewis here. There are occasional references, however, to large gangs of slaves, mostly black, employed in agriculture and the mines. The most unfortunate of all were those engaged in agricultural and other manual work in large-scale enterprises, such as, for example, the Zanj slaves used to drain the salt flats of southern Iraq, and the blacks employed in the salt mines of the Sahara and the gold mines of Nubia. These were herded in large settlements and worked in gangs. Large landowners or crown lands often employed thousands of such slaves, while domestic and commercial slaves were relatively well off. These lived and died in wretchedness. The military slaves were, in a sense, aristocrats of the slave population. However, black slaves were only occasionally employed as soldiers. This was not common and usually of brief duration. So we saw in the pricing that white slaves were often put into the military. This was the better status position, and it was rarely given to black slaves. Your thoughts?
So I'm just thinking about, and I'm still dancing around this in my mind, why they didn't put as much of an emphasis on that kind of labor aspect or military aspect. I mean, obviously it was there, but even from what we've seen here and in previous slides, it doesn't seem to be as prevalent as it would have been in other regions. I don't want to get too I don't want to get too deep in theory about it, but I mean, maybe it could be due to that mentality of jihad and identifying themselves as Muslim and being Arab, and something that they felt like they would take on themselves. Probably not it, but it's just something that's interesting to think about. And then the specific references to the type of slaves, like at the salt flats, the Zanj slaves, and others in the Sahara and the gold mines of Nubia, is very interesting because I know that that's a big thing. That's a big topic right now that's going on. In Africa, there are these videos that have come out of these large groups of they're not technically slaves, but with the wage that they're working for and the conditions that they're working in, at some point you have to wonder what the difference is. In these large embankments, mining for rare earth materials for batteries and cell phones and all these sort of things that we don't even think twice about, and yet you see them out there. And so that's a whole nother issue, of course, but it's just interesting to see how people can get worked up about that and, still either not know about these sort of things which have gone on, or deliberately look the other way in spite of knowing these things about Islam. But as Lloyd said, it's all what do they say, like down to the letter of Sharia. So not surprising.
Anything you want to add, Lloyd?
No, I summarized it well, but I'm trying to find some references in some of my own notes on how they collected these slaves and how many were killed in the process of just transporting them to their final destination. I mean, they lost huge number of them. I mean, 60-80% of them could die on the way to. So if they had 20 million slaves, they might have lost 80 million in the process of collecting those slaves. And so there's a lot of death here. And then also, if you look at some of the Islamic, he mentioned these slaves that are effectively indentured servants. Right? I mean, slavery is more rife today than it ever was. And in fact, you have slave markets in Libya, you have slave markets in Islamic countries today, in Africa, but For instance, in the book The Origins of the Islamic State, the Kitab Futuh al-Buldan, right, it's a Muslim book by Muslim scholars, they tell us you have to sell your children and wives in order to pay the poll tax. So in other words, the dhimmis had tax, and if they couldn't pay it, they had to sell their wives and children as slaves. And its people came to terms stipulating that their lives, property, and children be safe, and agreeing to pay the poll tax so that they wouldn't have their families sold into slavery. So this was another sword hanging over people's heads. Islam had this thing: if you couldn't pay your taxes, you sold your wife and your children into slavery. And in fact, it's such that once a family is captured, the wife's marriage to the husband is dissolved because she now becomes a slave that can be used by the master.
So we have a comment from Juliet here. Jonathan C. Brown, a convert to Islam, describes slavery and sex in his book as something halal and acceptable. So why do Abduls make a big deal of it when a Christian discusses it? I think that Lloyd kind of answered this earlier when he said anything that's offensive, whether it's true or not, is not allowed to be spoken.
Yeah, but when you're within your own circle and you're kind of, all in that armchair position, talking about these things, discussing these sort of things, it's kind of like that secret club of sorts. And so even though to the outside world, you put on this facade that you see it as offensive, when you're with your own, you don't have to put up that mirage, that facade. So.
And Trinity Matrix said, thank goodness we don't have any of this in Christianity. To be clear, we do have slavery in Christianity's history. However, we have the only movements to end slavery in Christian history as well. And ultimately, it's Christianity that put an end to slavery. It was just an accepted normal part of the ancient world. It wasn't race-based, to be clear, but slavery was a normal part of the ancient world, and it was the Christians who said, human beings have an inherent value. We probably shouldn't be buying and selling one another, and that's ultimately what led to its end. We'll come back to slavery in a minute with the Zanj Rebellion.
I have a question on that. How many slaves did Jesus own? Now, if Muhammad is superior to Jesus, then why did he have slaves if he has a better message, if he has a superior message?
Yeah.
I think it just comes down to, if everyone emulated Muhammad overnight, what would the world look like, versus if everyone emulated Jesus overnight, what would the world look like? I know that's a pretty simple way to kind of boil it down, but at heart, it gets to the meat of what the real differences are. And so, yeah, I think Lloyd makes a great point.
We're going to take a little bit deeper look at the status of Black people in the Islamic world by looking at 1001 Nights. I have Disney's logo up there. You won't find this in the Disney version of 1001 Nights, however. When Blacks are depicted in the stories, which they are fairly frequently, they always have these menial roles: porters, house servants, slaves, cooks, bath attendants, and very rarely rise above that level in society. And this doesn't necessarily reflect the author or authors of the tales. Rather, this is just a reflection of the way society was when the stories were written. As Lewis says, perhaps even more revealing in its way is the story of the good Black slave who lived a life of virtue and piety for which he was rewarded by turning white at the moment of his death. We're going to see that again and again, that for some reason, all of these Muslims are looking at the Quran, where it says that on the day of judgment, the faces of believers will turn white, and they're interpreting that to mean that anyone who is saved gets to have white skin, just like the houris of paradise. So this is reflective of the general status of Blacks in society, that they're relegated to these servant type roles. Even more telling, perhaps, are the two of the main characters of the 1001 Night Tales, King Shahzaman and King Shahriyar. They are, in Bernard Lewis's words, clearly white supremacists. The resemblance in 1001 Nights to certain aspects of the old American South is confirmed. When you read these stories, they are the two kings are constantly worried about what's going to happen to their wives while they're away from home, and how the black slaves are going to come upon their wives and defile them, and they describe in some rather graphic detail their fears of what's going to happen and how horrific this will be if it does. Your thoughts, Lloyd?
I mean, that's obvious. Being white, it's a reward to be white. It's a curse to be black. I think that's clear. I, you've made me think of some other notes which I've collected on this, and and then so I don't know if it's okay if I go off topic to introduce notes relevant to what we've discussed before.
Yeah, that's fine.
In 1825, Britain passed a law making slave trading punishable by death. Where did this happen in Islam? Never. And then 3 days before William Wilberforce died by an act of Parliament in 1833, the British abolished slavery itself, setting all 700,000 slaves in British overseas territories free. And he said, "Thank God I've lived to witness the day in which England is willing to give 20 million pounds sterling for the abolition of slavery." And then, of course, you have David Livingstone, missionary explorer, who wrote very, very graphic descriptions of what the Muslims did. 2 of the women had been shot the day before for attempting to untie their thongs. 1 woman had her infant's brains knocked out because she could not carry her load and the baby. And a man was dispatched, killed with an axe because he had broken down with fatigue. Those taken out of the country are but a very small section of the sufferers. We never realized the atrocious nature of the traffic until we saw it at the fountainhead. There truly Satan had his seat. Besides those actually captured, thousands are killed and die of their wounds and famine, driven from their villages by the warfare waged for slaves. And this is what we hear from David Livingstone, we presume. So he goes on very long discussions of the evils we have seen, the skulls, the ruined villages, the numbers who perish on the weight of the coast and the sea, the wholesale murders committed, who were allies with the Muslims to build up Arab villages elsewhere. And he speaks of, it's just horrific, the imagery. So this is David Livingstone. And the British only paid off their debt. That 20 million pounds of debt they racked up in the 1830s was only paid, I think, in like 2010.
Wow.
So Coco said that's a very interesting quote in the title. Where is it from? We'll get to that in a little bit. So we will see. It actually comes from a black poet, a black Islamic poet, kind of describing his own fate as a second-class citizen. Continuing on here. The conquest and the invention of race. So this is kind of my thesis here, that just as Europeans sought to justify the slave trade by inventing the concept of race, Muslims beat Europeans to the punch by 1,200 years, perhaps 1,200 years, for the same reason, that they were trying to justify their own conquests. And how can they do that? By saying the people they're conquering are subhuman. So during the period immediately following the death of Muhammad in 632, the great Islamic conquest took a new faith to vast areas of Asia and also Africa. A new situation was created, and many changes can be observed in the literature of the time. The first of these is the narrowing, specializing, and fixing of color terms applied to human beings. So what Lewis is saying is this is something new. It doesn't appear in literature before the Islamic conquest. In this time, Almost all color terms disappear apart from black, red, and white, and these become ethnic and absolute instead of personal and relative. So we kind of see how race is being invented. Previously, lots of different colors were used to describe people, getting into these more narrow categories that everyone is being put into one of three places. He writes, together with this specialization and fixing of color terms comes a very clear connotation of inferiority attached to darker and more specifically black skins. We'll look at the primary sources that back this in a second, but I think he is absolutely correct here. One more quote from him. From both the expressions and denunciations of racial prejudice in both general and religious literature, it is clear that a major transformation had taken place. In ancient Arabia, as elsewhere in antiquity, racism in the modern sense of the word was unknown. Yet from the literature, it is clear that a new and sometimes vicious pattern of racial hostility and discrimination had emerged within the Islamic world. So this is the last of the research. From here on, we'll be looking at primary sources. We'll go ahead and take this opportunity for my guests to introduce themselves. So, Io, what are your thoughts on this research of Bernard Lewis, and what do you do on your channel?
Hey everyone. Yeah, so as Thaddeus said, my name is Io. I have a YouTube channel called The Third Apology. It's been harder for me to be active on it as of late, but a lot of my videos would revolve around just jihad, instances of jihad in modern day culture, as well as just general kind of video essay-like talking points regarding Islam, looking at things relevant today or something more relevant in the past during its inception. So a lot of different things that I tend to talk about. But personally, I really have found myself drifting more toward the idea of jihad and just understanding the kind of thinking that goes into that, the theological basis for that, and how we see it, or how we've seen it, not just in Islam's military history, but also even today with various terror attacks and things of that nature. And regarding what we see here on the screen, I think it's very interesting because one of Robert Spencer's books, The History of Jihad, From Muhammad to ISIS, is an excellent book, which basically does exactly what it says in the title, recounts the history of jihad across many different regions of the world, from Islam's inception until the 21st century here now. And one of the things that I remember reading in the book that I thought was very interesting was just the kind of divide that would be had amongst Muslims regarding the status of those that they were conquering. Because if a person became a Muslim, all of a sudden they had these certain rights that they had protecting them, as opposed to them being a non-Muslim, right? Like you couldn't kill a fellow Muslim or things like that. And so, of course, I'm sure there were exceptions and things that happened that broke that. But I don't know, maybe they had some sort of Arab sort of tribalism that made it hard for them to then see, these Indians or these Africans that they were conquering as all of a sudden their fellow brothers, right? And so if maybe that was part of the prejudice, wanting to preserve that kind of Arab tribalism, even though they were all fighting amongst each other, which is interesting. But if that's part of what went into it, then I could see that as being a very understandable reason for them to then come up with this idea of race, or at least mainstream this idea of race, so that they could then say, okay, see, well, these people aren't even human at all, so forget about them being Muslim. Let's just conquer them. But again, I'm just speculating. I can't base that for certain, but it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think that you're right there. The Islamic texts regularly talk about Arab superiority. In my opinion, Islam was founded specifically for that purpose, to justify the conquest, to justify the superiority of the Arabs as they are taking over these new lands. And as you pointed out, if they allow people into Islam, then they have certain rights. So there might be this kind of perverse incentive to say that that person that I just conquered, they're not really allowed to be a full Muslim. Therefore, I don't have to give them that opportunity to convert. I can just take their stuff, so I can put them into slavery. I can get more benefit for myself without allowing them to be part of Islam. Lloyd, your thoughts on Bernard Lewis's research and what you do on your channel?
So on my channel, I discuss Islamic law. This is where most of my focus is. I go through the Islamic legal sources because Islam claims to be a theocrat. Well, Islam is a theocratic system. It is a religion of law. And Muslims obviously want to implement the Sharia and the fiqh. And then, of course, you can simply read these books because this is what they use in Islamic courts. Islam has judges, Islam has lawyers, Islam has practitioners of law, jurists. So we can read what they've written, and this is what I present. So it's Islamic law, which competes with the Western legal system. Christianity does not have a legal system. It certainly informs the law in the West, but it does not have what we'd call law. So it's got moral law. It doesn't have civil law. And of course, Muslims refuse to admit this because then they realize this would be embarrassing to Islam and damaging to Islam. I also have recently started discussing Islamic history. So I've researched Yemen and the pagan origins of Islam within Arab paganism. And then beyond that, I've also now started going into the history of atheism and secular humanism. And of course, atheism and secular humanism have very, very patchy, very dark, very violent, and very, well, inhuman, very dark history. So, of course, as religions, as competitive religions to Christianity, simply with the divinity, divine aspect removed. So this is what I do on my channel. And if I may, I want to add something to what Bernard Lewis is saying here, because Islam has a word for slaves, but that word has a dual meaning. So the word abd or abid. So it means a slave, in particular, a male slave. A female slave is being termed amma or plural imma, right? So abd singular, abid plural. Now, of course, you have abid kin, a slave born in his master's house, and abid mamaluka, a purchased slave. So Islam happens to have words for this. And Abd al-Bukhari, descendants of the black slaves who had been imported in large numbers by the Sadids into Morocco. Excellent. Abid al-Shira, black Sudanese slaves bought for the army under the Fatimids. So this is from the Encyclopedia of Islam. But then if we continue, if I go here to another source, if I go to abid, is an Arabic word meaning servant or slave. The term is sometimes used in the Arab world as an ethnic slur for black people and dates back to the Arab slave trade. So the term abid is used to refer to black people, and the same word is the word for slave. So black people have taken on this idea of being, the connotation is that if you're black, you're a slave. And this has made its way into the actual language of Islam.
So Ultimate Truth on his third different username here. He says 100 dummies attending a class that teaches racism started 1400 years ago with the prophet of the Muslims. You cannot block me. Well, I can block you, and I have blocked one particular Muslim troll more than 20 times. I haven't blocked you at all yet, but I suggest you focus on the topic here, and more importantly, you focus on the evidence. Just asserting that someone's dumb for believing this in no way addresses the evidence. We're about to look at a bunch of primary sources. If you want to try to claim that these primary sources aren't racist, feel free to do so. But until you do that, you're not contributing anything to this conversation, and you will be ignored.
This is just distraction. This is simply deflection. He's not attending to the evidence. He's not
just fluff.
Examining the evidence. So this is a waste of our time. It's a waste of our time.
So I do have a somewhat useful comment from a Muslim here from Agha Abbas. Islam makes freeing a slave a righteous act. See Surah 2, 177. Prophet said slaves are your brothers. So Agha probably hasn't seen the first part of this. We did discuss, and I will mention a couple more times, that there are forces in Islam that are against slavery. I really shouldn't say against slavery. That's not even really a question, but that feel that black people shouldn't be the only slaves, or that black people are just as good Muslims. However, they're the minority view, and as we've discussed a couple times, having some good verses does not get rid of the other verses as well. or the many hadith or any of these secondary sources, which will show how the early Muslims understood the teachings of Muhammad. You can claim that you don't find them racist all you want. That doesn't explain why the early Muslims, who are supposed to be the best Muslims, supposed to understand it the best, and logically would be the most likely to understand what Muhammad meant, since they're connected in time, doesn't explain why they saw it as racist. Anything you guys want to add on this?
Well, on that point, the early Muslims, the first three generations are considered the best of the Muslims, and then the Muslims become diluted and watered down after that, which means that Aga Abbas is obviously the worst of the Muslims, the weakest, the most diluted, the least of the Muslims today. I mean, this is obvious because Muhammad said that as time went on, Muslims would become less and less righteous, less and less Muslim, basically. So Aga Abbas is the weakest generation, the worst generation. Just thought I'd point it out, Aga Abbas. Also, if we go to the Islamic law, we can read that, for instance, that there is no penalty for a Muslim for killing a kafir, nor on a Muslim for killing a slave. This is repeated. There is no blood money on the master for killing his slave, right? And a Muslim is not killed for killing a kafir, even if he has apostatized from Islam, nor is a free man killed for killing a slave. This is repeated over and over. A man is not killed for killing his own slave. This is repeated within the Islamic law. So not only can you free a slave and that's considered a righteous act, you did a nice thing, you can also murder your slave and that's okay. Allah doesn't care.
Yeah, there's a difference between saying that slavery is wrong and saying if you choose to free someone of your own free will, that's a good thing. Um, you know, that doesn't in any way say that slavery is wrong. It just says that you've done something nice, that you've freed someone.
Yeah.
The fact that slavery is allowed and encouraged in the Islamic text is not really even a question. And indeed, many modern Muslims who are not afraid of actually teaching what their religion says will say exactly that. They'll say that slavery is a part of Islam. If you don't like that, too bad. You don't get to decide what Islam is. That was decided by Muhammad.
And also, the term slave actually comes from the Slavs from Central and Eastern Europe because they were the slaves, white people. Don't forget, something like 400,000 slaves were taken from Africa to North America. But we know of at least 1.5 million slaves were taken by Muslims from Europe to Islamic countries, to Africa. So there's at least a minimum of 4 times more slavery that occurred from Muslims going to Europe and stealing white blonde women and boys versus the number of slaves that went from Africa to North America. But why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't the Muslims talking about how they stole so many more slaves from Europe over hundreds of years?
Any other thoughts
And white
before we
slaves.
start?
Sorry? Yeah.
Any other thoughts before we dive into the primary text and see what the Muslims were saying in their own words?
No, I think I'm good. I think Lloyd said it very well. I'm ready to check out these sources.
All righty. So we start with we're going to be looking at a number of poets. We're going to start with Suaym, who died in 660. So right around the same time as Muhammad, just barely after his time. His name translates as little black man. So this clearly isn't his real name. It's the only name that he's known by, though. We don't know what his real name was. He writes the following poetry. If my color were pink, woman would love me, but the Lord has marred me with blackness. Though I am a slave, my soul is nobly free. Though I am black of color, my character is white. I am covered with a black garment, but under it there is a lustrous garment with white skirts. Your thoughts, Ayo?
I think the first few are pretty blunt in what they're saying, but I'm thinking about that last one. Is him saying black garment symbolic for his skin, or is it actually a piece of clothing? And I don't know, maybe I'm just getting confused.
Yeah, I think that he's talking about his skin.
Yeah, yeah. But
It's
saying
saying
like, oh, don't.
even though I have black skin, underneath, I'm white because I'm virtuous.
Mhm. Yeah. So I mean, here we basically see the kind of personal expression of the very same sentiments that we saw within our beginning sources from the Hadith, right? Where we see how Allah curses one group to hell based off of this one characteristic versus another, or creates one to be disregarded or looked down upon versus another. And what we see here in this poetry is basically the expression of that sentiment, right? I mean, if you have this person who died around 660. Obviously, he had experience with Islam, and as Lloyd said, this is supposed to be the best version of it, considering its earliness. Then we have to ask the question, what would cause him to walk away with this sort of idea about not just himself, but the idea of being black in general? And I mean, it's a tragedy that he thinks this way, but at the same time, you can't really blame him if the kind of sources that we've been looking at and the kind of things that have been expressed have been imposed on him or expressed to him via these Muslims. I'm not sure what region he was from or what sort of experiences he had in specificity, but it's still very interesting to see for sure.
Anything you want to add, Lloyd?
No, I'm fine. No. This is, I mean, garment with white skirts. Yeah, well, maybe he was trans. I don't know. It's very popular today. You know,
He
uh,
Muhammad wore some female
but
clothes, right? So
I mean, yeah. So, I mean, today
Yeah.
I saw an 85-year-old woman on the bus give up her seat for a pregnant man. It was touching. Very, very touching. You know, so yeah. No, this is. I mean, clearly there's an issue here. Look, I'm black. I'm from Africa, and born and raised. And I mean, this kind of hits close to the bone. So it upsets me that Islam is so thoroughly racist. Muhammad was such a thorough racist, and yet you go to America and you look at American Muslims going on and on about how Christianity is the white man's religion and they need to follow the racist Muhammad.
And this is why I get so I just get in such disbelief, when I see black Muslims. Now I get it if they were raised into it, they didn't know any better. But when you see those who maybe say the same sort of thing that Lloyd just said about Christianity and then make the conscious decision to convert to Islam, to me that just throws out any sort of credibility because it tells me that they haven't done their due diligence, they haven't truly looked at Muhammad, and these things. I mean, of course, Muslims aren't going to be shouting it from the rooftops, but anyone that has a bit of skepticism or scrutiny in their hearts won't have any trouble finding these sort of things, And so when I see that, it just tells me that due diligence hasn't been done, and it's really a shame because I mean, the irony is incredible, right? When you see these sort of things from Muhammad, from the Hadith, from Allah, right, and then yet people who are the very subjects of these kind of sentiments are converting. I mean, it's honestly just baffling.
Yeah. So this is actually the quote that's in the title there. The Lord has marred me with blackness. And remember, this is a black poet describing his own situation. He's saying, if I had lighter skin, I could get lots of women, but I can't because God has cursed me with dark skin. Next up, we have Ubayd Allah ibn Abi Bakr, who was the son of a black slave, but he managed to rise to the rank of governor. So this is early on in Islam, and as we see, the role of blacks is going to diminish as we move forward in history. However, he managed to rise to the role of governor, and we have some coins of his on the screen here. An Arab poet describing the Ubayds here says that, quote, the blacks do not earn their pay by good deeds and are not of good repute. The children of a stinking Nubian black, God put no light in their complexion. So obviously this is a critic of him, but why is he choosing to describe his opposition to the governor by referring to his skin color? Your thoughts, Lloyd?
It has a negative connotation. I mean, we've been seeing over and over that being black in South Africa, this is not something that's common today, but some guys will be familiar with this. whether it's true or not, but there was a particular propaganda that was very popular in South Africa during the apartheid era, where they would call black people the sons of Ham, which is Ham, the sons of Ham. Now, of course, in the Bible, there is no reference to the sons of Ham being black, but the idea was that you were the sons of Ham, and therefore you were less than. Being black made you less than, and this was considered a sort of a major sin to accuse black people of being lesser than. And here you've got over and over Muslims doing the very same thing. This whole apartheid idea. Now apartheid's a separate topic, and I'll go there another time. But here you've got this whole thing, and Muslims are defending it. And while this is very reminiscent of what was considered a crime against humanity under apartheid.
Anne says, it seems a different Islam is being spoon-fed to English speakers with a very whitewashed past and tweaked narrative. Muhammad is morphed into a champion of slaves and an early feminist. Exactly. That's why we're doing this. I'm not doing this to say that Islam is false. I have stronger arguments for Islam being false than it being racist. However, we need to combat the false narrative, because people often make decisions based on emotion. And if someone says, without any basis in fact, that Christianity is racist and Islam is anti-racist, then there's a good chance that the person will think highly of Islam as a result and won't bother to look into the facts. So here we are bringing out the facts.
And Thaddeus, all that does too, even if it's indirect, is provide a sort of cover for those Muslims around the world who are still propagating slavery. Lloyd, at a time when he shared some of his notes with me, he had a section about Islam and slavery, and there was a map on there showing the location of the world's slaves today. Only about 60,000, not only as if, that doesn't matter, but still in comparison, 60,000 in the US compared to, an insane amount in India, Western Africa, many parts of Africa. And these are the people that are not being acknowledged, right? These are the people that are being swept under the rug because of the narrative. And so even though I don't think people in the US that are supporting Islam are saying, okay, this slavery which is going on in Libya is good, they can kind of indirectly provide that cover for it by not calling it out, or not at least being willing to scrutinize it for where it should be, so that these sort of things get brought into the light and condemned.
That is an excellent point. In race sensitivity trainings at work, they often make a point that talking about these things is very important. If you just sweep them under the rug, that kind of allows them to perpetuate. And that's what's happened in Islam. We're talking about early Muslims here, but it's true today as well that there is widespread racism in the Islamic world, and it is allowed to continue because no one wants to talk about it. Yeah. So next up, we have another black poet, Nusayb ibn Rabad. We have an Arab poet describing him. I saw Nusayb astray among men. His color was that of cattle. You can tell him by his shining blackness. Even as he be oppressed, he had the dark face of an oppressor. He responds, if I am jet black, musk too is very dark, and there is no medicine for the blackness of my skin. Io, how do you feel being compared to cattle and that your face is dark like that of an oppressor?
Well, I thought, there's some white cattle with black spots, but it doesn't really work. So, we have multiple things going on here, right? With the comparison of the skin colors of cattle, we at least indirectly see this sort of connection being made between a black person and an animal, right? Because I'm sure if you said that, a Muslim had the skin complexion of whatever brown sort of creature you could come up with, they'd take that as insulting, right? Because you're equating them with that animal, regardless of, it's an animal nonetheless, right? And so it seems lesser. So we have that going on. I'm interested in the aspect here where it talks about the dark face of an oppressor. I'm not sure what they mean by that term, like if there's some sort of context to this, or it's kind of a loaded term that has some history to it. But it does say even if he be oppressed, he had the dark face of an oppressor. I don't think they mean that the black people had control over them. So, I mean, maybe it just means that if they have a dark face, they're seen as evil or just malevolent or something of that nature. I'm not sure. I'd be interested in that.
Yeah, I think that you're probably right, that
Yeah.
it's probably an indirect reference to the Quran where evil people get dark faces on the day of judgment.
Yeah, rather than something like in that actual time and place of, like black people ruling or something like that. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so of course, I mean, the whole being compared to an animal is ridiculous. I want to say something about the last line, but I also kind of want to leave it for Lloyd as well, just in case. But yeah, that's what I see. That's what I see so far.
Yeah, Thaddeus, I've just sent you a link. Can you bring it up and just show it on the screen for a moment, please? It's that hadith that you posted earlier. If you can just show that.
Yes. Yeah, give me 1 second to bring that up.
While he's doing that, I'll say as well that the last line as well about there being no medicine for the blackness of my skin, right? So this is where you've had that sort of negative impact in terms of what you've imparted onto society when they think like that in the first place, right? When they think that it's something that needs medicine to begin with, right? They're basically conditioned to see it as a condition that needs to be cured, and that alone is a big tell-all of where they're at in terms of the society as well.
So we have the permissibility of selling animals.
Can you just
for
show
animals.
it on the screen?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I shared it, but I forgot I have to actually add it.
Yeah.
There.
So notice that hadith that you mentioned earlier. Once you add it, notice that hadith. So Allah's apostle said, "Sell him to," and he bought him for 2 black slaves, right? And he did not afterwards take allegiance from anyone until he asked whether he was a slave. Notice the chapter heading 23, the permissibility of selling animals for animals of the same kind and of different quality. They're speaking here of a human, a black human slave, but the chapter heading is the permissibility of selling animals for animals. I think that game, set, and match, case closed.
Yeah, and here
and
we
if these
have...
and if these hadith were supposedly written, hundreds of years afterward, then obviously we have to think about what's gone on in that time to even cause that sort of thinking to be at play. I mean, whether this was actually something that happened during Muhammad's life, or even if Muhammad existed, is a whole different thing. But regardless, according to the standard Islamic narrative, I mean, this is 200 years afterward. And so what trajectory are they on? And has that played into what we see today? And you can almost
just scroll down again,
yes.
Thaddeus, because you've taken away the heading, the title, which is more important here, which I wanted to bring attention to.
You're going to say something, Thaddeus?
I was going to say that this kind of reflects the same attitude as what we saw from the poet describing the black poet, that he feels that he's like an animal.
That's why I brought it up, because I've got extensive notes on slavery in Islam as well. And I mean, this is what they say, that you are an animal. They were selling animals. The black people are considered animals. This is Muhammad, and this is now Sahih Muslim. So what are we supposed to take from this? That these people are seen with respect, with honor, with high regard, or are they seen as merely we are trading animals? Because that's what it says in the chapter title.
Yeah, and then the chapter title would be the words of Imam Muslim, but it clearly reflects the attitude that was prevalent at the time, or else, it wouldn't have been allowed to become one of the authoritative hadith collections. So, just in fairness, Muhammad's not technically saying that, but Muslim is. He's saying that I'm gathering together the hadith, and this is how I'm going to categorize this particular hadith.
Yep. Yeah, and as someone said, the oral tradition is perfectly preserved, so we shouldn't argue about that.
Yeah, well, fine. In this case, I'm willing to grant that. If they want to claim this for Muhammad's words, that's fine by me. Just give me 1 second here. So it's a little more difficult when I'm doing everything than when I'm just hosting someone else speaking. All right, so continuing on here. So we have Jair. He's describing another black poet. Jair is a very famous Arabian poet, and he's describing the black poet Al-Haykuten. When he sees him in a white shirt, he describes him as a donkey's penis wrapped in papyrus. The Haykuten responds, though my hair is woolly and my skin coal black, my hand is open and my honor bright. So we see the racist comment from the Arab, and then we see his response saying, yeah, you're right about the way I look. However, I still have the same ability to access Allah as you do, kind of. And like I said, there is this thread within Islam of people pushing back against this racist thought. However, they're going to lose out. But as we get further and further in history, we're not going to see barely anyone standing up for the equality of Black Muslims. And even ignoring the way history worked out, the fact that any Muslims are looking at the words attributed to Muhammad, looking at the Quran, and they're coming to these racist conclusions when we don't see this racist thought in pre-Islamic Arabia is very telling, in my opinion. Any thoughts you want to add to this one?
Clearly, there was some kind of supremacism that took place, some kind of degeneration that occurred. It's hard to explain why they became this way, but clearly there's some kind of supremacism at work and a very dim view of Black people.
Yeah.
So I mean,
and notice and again.
You know?
Oh, go ahead, Lloyd. I'm sorry.
No, please go on.
I was just going to say, and again, notice these years at which they died, and assuming, I mean, they had a decent lifespan. I mean, they were in the throes of this supposed golden age of Islam, right at the beginning, when, I mean, not the beginning, so to speak, of Muhammad, but shortly afterward, with its spread across these different regions. And these are the sort of things that they're saying, which honestly are extreme, right? And so these mainstream Muslims today who want to say, oh, well, it started off peaceful, and maybe it's people who have come along now in the 21st century who have twisted certain things. I mean, here we go. This might as well be the beginning, relatively speaking. And these are the sort of things that we see being expressed. And notice his response. It's not, hey, where did you get this idea from? Or, I mean, how dare you say such a thing? Or, this kind of shock, as if this idea or these remarks were just pulled out of thin air. I mean, he acknowledges that, at least in this society he's in and how he sees himself, that he's visually lesser, right? But he tries to counteract it by still saying that his honor is bright and his hand is open. But we don't see him necessarily pushing back against this, against these remarks that Black people are somehow less, which just goes to show how pervasive it likely was. Again, I don't know which region they were from or where they were in or any of that sort of stuff, but it's still very telling.
So I have a couple of comments from the audience along the same lines. H.J. Evan, are these hadiths supposed to be the Sahaba? And Coco Jasmine, Muslims will easily dismiss these sources because they are not from Muhammad and the Sahaba. To be clear, I'm not saying that these sources are authoritative to Muslims. What I'm saying is that these sources reflect societal attitude brought about by Islam, right? So we're looking at the effects of Islam. We looked at the hadith, we looked at the Quran, we looked at Ibn Ashaq and what the words he attributes to Muhammad in the previous show. And now we're looking at the effect of those words. So the point here is that, Muslims can try to argue that these things aren't racist all they want. But when we look at the society that Muhammad brought about, or whoever founded Islam brought about, we see that these words are creating a more and more racist society as time goes on. So This time we're looking at the effect. I agree, these sources are not authoritative to Muslims, but that doesn't mean they're not important, because history is important. This shows us what the correct interpretation, or at least the interpretation that Muhammad would say is the best interpretation, since it comes from the early Muslims, is about these things. Mm-hmm. Someone with an Arabic name who's probably ultimate truth, he says, question for Thaddeus: do Arabs consider the words black and white the same way we Westerners consider them? As a black man, according to Arabs, a man from Africa with black skin? And to that, I will just say, pay attention. We can ask a Muslim apologist and they'll say no. But we can look at how actual Arabic speakers, early Muslims, interpreted these things. We can look at how later Muslims interpreted these things. And I'm sure that the concept isn't exactly 100% identical, but it's pretty similar. Mm-hmm. All right, moving on. So we have here an insulting gift. So the historian Geographer writes about a gift given to a provincial governor in the last Umayyad Caliph. He was given a single black slave. The Caliph instructs his secretary to write a sarcastic thank you note for the poor quality gift that he has received. Hamid, his secretary, writes, had you been able to find a smaller number than one and a color worse than black, you would have sent that as a gift. So here the Caliph is receiving a gift of a single black slave, and he's saying, you only sent one because that's the minimum number you could send, and you sent a black slave because that's the worst type of slave you could send. Your thoughts, Ayo?
Multiple things. We see it here affirming the, what was his name, Bernard Lewis. We see it affirming the kind of hierarchical structure that he outlined regarding which kind of slaves were worth more versus others, because I'm positive that his reaction would have not been the same had it been, a white European woman or something similar, someone similar. So we see that being confirmed, right? But then we also see how societally and culturally, it's really something when they're not just when Black people are not just a group to demean or insult, but they themselves are also kind of used as a sort of punchline, right? I mean, this is supposed to be some sort of humor, and we see this Black person, unnamed, we don't know anything about them except their skin color. They're a punchline, right, for what's going on here. And I think that is the real marking, or one of the realest markings of a culture which is truly racist and truly does not regard people of a different skin tone or skin color as worthy of that respect. Because when you see people that you don't deem worthy of respect, you make light of it, right? You make humor out of them. And that's exactly what we see here. It's not even just, they mistreated them and this was wrong and people were trying to do better, but no, it's not only did they know that they mistreated them, but they fully embraced it, even to the point of using them as punchlines. So it's very, very interesting to see.
Anything you want to add, Lloyd?
Clearly, as part of the fabric, part of the culture, this kind of attitude, and it's also part of Sunnah, it's part of Muhammad's attitude, which is now bled over into the rest of his followers. And just a point that with the castration you mentioned earlier, 6 out of every 10 Black boys between 8 and 12 were castrated.
Wow.
That the Muslims captured. And then the Caliph in Baghdad at the beginning of the 10th century had 7,000 Black eunuchs and 4,000 white eunuchs. So this is by Ronald Siegel, Islam's Black Slaves, the Other Diaspora. So that's a book on the topic as well. And Islamic slavery is the longest yet least discussed of the major slave trades. And Islamic slavery predates the Atlantic slave trade by 700 years and continued up until the 1960s. For instance, in the UAE and Saudi, they only banned slavery in the 1960s. But this was under pressure from obviously, Western countries.
Yeah, so I had notes on that as well. It was very, very crazy to see that.
Yeah. So this is, so I don't know why Muslims want to have this, hold the moral high ground. For instance, Mauritania in Africa, which is a Muslim country as well, it only criminalized slavery in August of, guess the year?
2000 something.
2007.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
So Mauritania only criminalized slavery in August of 2007. So, I mean, this is what we're dealing with.
And only under heavy pressure from what at least Muslims would describe as Christian nations. Very interesting.
And then you have to also wonder too. I mean, even if they have these sort of things in paper, how hard is it actually being enforced? I don't want to give a certain country a bad rap if they really are. I just don't know. But that is something to consider, right? I mean, if they've held on to it for this long, I mean, if you've gone a certain direction for so long, and then all of a sudden overnight you decide you want to change because you've adopted some sort of new legislation or something. I'm not saying that the government's still fostering it, but how much do they turn the other way, right? How much do they still tolerate because you still have this inside? I mean, because if that's 2007, you still have a whole generation that is well and alive, well and kicking, who has known that slavery very intimately. And so to get them to give up something like that is something that is no small feat. And so I wonder how much governments of that nature are tolerating those sort of things at the very
look,
least.
there's never been an abolition movement in Islam.
Yeah, great point. Great point.
Carol says mass castration was one of the many atrocities of Islam, particularly the Ottoman Empire. And this is why we don't see descendants of Africans in the Islamic world, or the Middle East, at least. Obviously, there are Muslim countries that are predominantly black, but because all the slaves were castrated, they didn't foster any children. So you don't see their descendants alive today, which kind of helps cover up the history.
It's crazy to think about that many people not having kids and just being out there and living and dying there as slaves. It's actually a very jarring thought.
Yeah. I mean, for instance, like the Hungarians were hunted like animals by the Turks, and 3 million Hungarians, right? Hungary's a tiny country. It's got like 50 people in the whole country, right? 3 million Hungarians were taken into slavery over a 150-year period between the 15 and 1600s, right? In India, a minimum of 200,000 Hindus were captured and transported to Iranian slave markets in just 1619 and 1620, right? And then, of course, some idiot wants to come into the comments and say, oh, Islam is growing because of you, is the fastest growing religion thanks to you guys. Look, that has nothing to do with the topic. Understand? They simply cannot deal with the truth of Islam. This is what it is. Now, of course, there's no shaming of Muslims. There's no shaming of Islamic countries for what they did. But of course, think about this: 13 to 1400 years of Islamic slavery. The American slave trade lasted something like 72 years. Right? You had a 72-year American slave trade, and we still haven't heard the end of it. Right? Americans went to war to abolish slavery. Islam has never had an abolition movement. They were hunting in Europe. They were taking people from Denmark into slavery. What the heck were they doing there?
Right? Were you, Lloyd, were you the one that mentioned in the last stream about the sack of Baltimore when they went up to Ireland?
Yeah.
It was just,
Ireland, Iceland, Greenland. What the heck?
Crazy. And it just goes to show, I mean, again, you can't look at the past with too much regret within your own life, but still, when you think about all these things that I mean, myself, I wasn't in high school too long ago, a few like 5 or 6 years, right? And we came nowhere near to touching any of these sort of things, to the point where, I mean, none of us even knew that this stuff existed. And I get you can't teach everything, but at some point, a conscious decision has to be made regarding what the focus is going to be on. And so, as Lloyd said, if this is the thing that has gone on for longer and had so much more of an impact, even until today, I mean, it only makes logical sense that would be the thing that we focus on, and yet we don't, because obviously there's more at play than just the cold hard facts and the truth. There's that actual narrative. So, I mean, it's that narrative that causes commenters like that to come through and completely ignore the actual topic.
I mean, Peter says, I mean, who knows? Maybe the guy's IQ is lower than his shoe size. Who knows? But European slavery lasted about 300 years. Islamic slavery lasted 1,300 years. Okay. Now, if they took 3 million people from Hungary, how many did they take from Poland, Sweden, Ireland, England? They invaded those places, right? So understand that you've got a culture here that has been practicing slavery for over 1,000 years. right? And no one says a word about it. But America was vilified for having slavery for 72 years. And they had, at absolute best, a quarter of the slaves that the Africans took from Europe. Never mind the, 20 to 80 million that were taken from Africa to Saudi Arabia.
All right, moving on here, we have a couple of descriptions of themselves by Black poets. We have Nusayb al-Asgar. He describes himself, "Black man, what have you to do with love? Give over chasing white girls if you have any sense. An Ethiop black like you has no means of access to them." And we have Abu Dulama, whose name means the father of blackness, so obviously not his real name as well, describing his own family. "We are alike in color. Our faces are black and ugly. Our names are shameful." Just a quick note about the slide here. This fella here, he won a contest for ugliest person. So he voluntarily put his face out there. I didn't purposely, put him out there to make fun of him. He wants to be known as the ugliest person. So I thought that was pretty apt description here. So what do you think about these two Black poets? One saying they have no access to white girls, so there's no, or lighter skinned girls. Presumably, it really means Arabs here, and so they have no access to these people. So there's no interracial marriage, and the father of blackness, which is one of the most famous poets, saying that his family is ugly because they are black.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first section, for sure. I mean, even if they tried to break past social norms of not going after white women, I mean, again, we've talked about the castration and all of that that's gone on. So I wouldn't be surprised if they were just physically limited in that factor, anyways. But honestly, even if the castration weren't there, I think the sheer intimidation alone and the sheer social pressure to not even attempt something like that, right? Of going for a woman of a different skin tone or opposite race or whatever, would have dissuaded many of them from even considering it or trying it because of the consequences. And so again, we see an extreme amount of gatekeeping, an extreme amount of oppression in that way. And I mean, it only makes sense then that we see these sort of things being written.
Yeah. On this point, then having no hope, no future, no access to love, an interesting point by David Livingston. He raises this in his memoirs from his time in Africa. And he says, why are they capturing these men? To convert them to Islam, but I mean, so a commentary on his notes, but in order to get their wealth so that they can take it back to their villages. But he writes, the strangest disease I have seen in this country seems to be the broken-heartedness, and it attacks free men who have been captured and made slaves. They ascribe their pain to their heart. It really seems that broken heart is the reason that they die. The Arabs would often promise a present of the villagers if they would act as a guide to some distant point. But as soon as they were far enough away from their friends, they were seized and pinned into slave sticks or yokes, from which there was no escape. And Islamic courts. So there's a large body of Sharia law cases in which Black African Muslims complain in the courts, the Islamic courts, that the Muslim slave traders will take Black African Muslims if they cannot find Kafirs. And of course, what they don't tell you is that the Muslims ran the slave trade up and down Africa, and they were the ones selling the slaves to the Europeans.
Yeah. And that one example that you listed there about them tricking them into leading them away from their village, I think answers at least partly your question from earlier regarding how they actually went and got these people, right? Like what was the actual process in which they rounded
It's
them
just
up?
raiding parties and slaughter. So yeah, but that's some of the ways that they would do this. So yeah, I mean, so Livingston also remarked that having a broken heart, just no hope. They stole their hope, and this killed them. They tore them from their family and promised them a life of horror.
Continuing on here at our look at Islamic sources. So we have Jais of Basra. So far we've looked at poets from mostly the 8th century. And after that time, as we're moving into the 9th century now, the presence of Black poets pretty much disappears entirely. Uh, Jais is perhaps an exception, although his ancestry is not exactly clear. Some sources say that he was a quarter Black, that he had a Black grandmother. Other sources say that he was half. Um, but regardless, he was at least seen as somewhat Arabian. And he wrote this work called The Boast of Blacks Against Whites. And I found multiple Muslims quoting this source as some kind of grand proof that Islam was not racist. Even if it is straightforward that he is actually celebrating Black people, then that would kind of actually imply that there is racism, or there'd be no reason to write this work to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
However, the work may actually be satire. He may be parodying the Suayya, who declared that everyone was equal, that the Arabs were not superior over other Muslims. And the way they did this is by lauding their own achievements. So he might be mocking them by taking this group that everyone agrees achievements aren't very great and saying, oh, look how great their achievements are, as a way of disproving their work. And the reason that we say this, well, one is because he's very sarcastic in his work in general. And as we're going to see on the next slide, in other works of his, he was a vehement defender of Arab superiority and wrote quite racist things. However, in this work, The Boast of Blacks Against Whites, he defends against charges of weakness of mind, lack of discernment, and ignorance of consequences. And he says, how is it that we have never seen a Zanj who had the intelligence even of a woman or of a child? So the Zanj or Zanji, as it put here, are going to be the sub-Saharan Africans. We're going to see a couple distinguishing terms, and this term is used of the people that we would now call sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, but also the Arab slave trade sparked what is considered perhaps the largest slave rebellion in history. And this is called the Zanj Rebellion,
Mm-hmm.
which happened near Basra in southern Iraq. And it happened over 15 years from 869 to 883. And I mean, this involved harsh treatment of Africans in salt mines and over 500,000 slaves. So this was a huge rebellion against Islamic slavery. Now, here's the thing: Muslims never apologize and have never apologized for the slavery in their history. And of course, yet all white people have to bend over and pass out the Vaseline because some hundreds of years ago there was slavery in the West. Right. But of course, the Muslims are the ones catching the slaves. The Muslims are the ones selling the slaves. Right. And of course, the Muslims are the one also transporting slaves. So we've got a slave trade that was 3-4 times longer, and a slave trade that was at least 200 times larger. When are the Muslims going to apologize? Why are they simply dismissing all these facts? They want to point the finger at the West and absolutely refuse to accept any responsibility for their own culpability and guilt.
So let's take this work at face value first, ignore the possibility that it's satire. Uh, what would defense against things like charges of weakness of mind or this particularly telling one where the Zanj supposedly have less intelligence than a woman and a child? Would that imply that there is no racism, or would it imply that racism was prevalent, even if he's arguing against it? What do you think, Io?
Prevalent. I mean, because if there would be no, like you said yourself, there would be no reason to even present these sort of arguments if there weren't these attacks being leveled in the first place, right? I mean, if they're unless they were being called weak in mind, or unless they were being charged with having no discernment or no regard for the consequences, he'd have no reason to come out and give this sort of defense. I do find it interesting that they had to throw in the jab in there about women. Of course, that also says what else is going on in the society. So, I mean, child does understand what the child doesn't know as much, but still, like, I mean, the things in Islam about women, we can see kind of indirectly referenced there. But yeah, unless it was an actual thing going on, there'd be no reason to even pay it any sort of mind or regard it to begin with.
Exactly. Malcolm Layton says, if you don't know your history, it'll be misrepresented, weaponized, and used against you.
It's so true.
And that's exactly what we see today, that Islam's history has been used against, or for Islam and against Christianity, even though when you look at the actual history, it doesn't support any of their claims. However, let's get the full picture of Jaiz here. So like I said, he's a strong defender of Arab superiority. And he writes, we know the Zanj are the least intelligent and least discerning of mankind, and the least capable of understanding the consequences of actions. Like a crow among mankind, the Zanj are the Zanj, for they are the worst of men and the most vicious of creatures in character and temperament. They, the Subaya, maintain that eloquence is prized in all people and in all times, even the Zanj, despite their dimness, their boundless stupidity, their obtuseness, their crude perceptions, and their evil dispositions, make long speeches. So perhaps we're getting his true feelings here, or maybe he changed his mind over time. But either way, I don't see how you can take these as anything but extremely racist statements, because he's talking about a large group of people, millions of people, and he's just categorically saying that they're the worst creatures on earth.
And the interesting thing to note as well is, from what I'm seeing, the Zanj Rebellion didn't even start until 869, when he actually died. So anyone that's trying to grasp at any sort of straws could say, oh, well, this was in the midst of the rebellion. They had, they had caused so much damage or done this or that to their Arab society or whatever. Even then, I don't think it would still be justified. But still, I mean, this was, I mean, I don't know when these things that he expressed were written, but if he died in 869, they had to have been before the rebellion. And so, I mean, already right there, I mean, maybe it's these same sentiments that were constantly being expressed to the Zanj that played a role in them feeling this way and ultimately rebelling in 869 onward.
Anything you want to add, Lloyd?
No, I've already said something about the Zanj, so yeah. But I mean, that was, yeah.
Yeah, we're going to have a couple. We're going to get to the Zanj Rebellion shortly. I've kind of been doing things chronologically, and as I would point out, it hasn't happened yet, which is why we haven't got into it. So Lewis points out a well-known proverb of Arabia that was written around the same time. Obviously, a proverb, you don't know exactly when it's written, but it originates in the same time period, describing the Zanj. When he is hungry, he steals. When he is satiated, he fornicates. There's also a hadith that this proverb is attributed to Muhammad, not a canonical hadith, but a lesser quality hadith, except he says it's the Ethiopians rather than the Zanj. So he says, when the Ethiopian is hungry, he steals. When he is sated, he fornicates. So basically, it's a comparison to animals, right? Like the only thing that a Zanj or an Ethiopian wants is to eat when they're hungry, and when they're not hungry, then they want to have sex. And that's all they're about, because they're just animals with carnal instincts. Anything you want to add?
I think it's pretty compared to what we've been reading, it's pretty straightforward.
It's pretty obvious.
Yeah, they as I said, they get more and more explicit as we move along. So now we come to the Zanj Rebellion. From 869 to 883, a series of revolts took place against the Abbasid Caliphate, beginning in modern-day Iraq. The Muslim historians describe it as brutally violent, a major threat to the power of the ruling Abbasid class. It brings economic chaos, widespread destruction, and ends with between 300,000 and 2.5 million dead. Obviously, It's very difficult to put precise numbers on ancient history, especially when you're talking about the deaths of a bunch of people that, frankly, no one really cared about.
Yeah.
Modern scholars have debated whether the composition of the rebels was, entirely slaves, mostly impoverished free people, and they debate what portion were black as well, because there were definitely other people involved. You start rebelling against the ruling class, anyone who has a gripe with them may start participating. But what is perfectly clear is that the event is linked with Black Africans in the mind of Muslim historians, which is why it took the name Zanj Rebellion. You see historian after historian, Muslim historian, near contemporary people writing in the centuries after this, and they're blaming the Zanj, and they're blaming the black slaves that were forced into this hard labor in the salt fields and like things, which we read about earlier. So whatever the historical fact is, in Islam, it absolutely becomes associated exclusively with black people. I know Lloyd's already talked about this, but anything you want to add?
Oh, no, I'm actually going through my notes now to find out what I can on the whole Zanj idea.
Anything you want to add, Ayo?
No, I was doing some peripheral reading about it earlier. It is very interesting just to hear about how large of a threat they considered it, and as well as, I mean, again, the range is pretty large, between 300,000 to 2.5 million. But I mean, still, I remember hearing in school about certain slave rebellions in the and I'm blanking on the name right now, in the U.S. There was one in particular I vividly remember learning about. But again, if are we just focusing on this because it's the US, or are we focusing on it because it's bad, right? And so if it's bad, then this should have been at the top of the list, or at least up there, as should have the whole Arab slave trade. But again, I mean, most people haven't even heard of this. Most people haven't even heard of the Zanj people to begin with. And so
E.W. Arnold has a story that the Arabs tell of a boat that was driven to the Zanj country in 922, and they called the Zanj man-eaters, and they expected to be eaten. So the Zanj was supposed to be eating men.
Yeah, the last class of things that I have for today are the geographers, and you're going to find that they do describe Zanj in that fashion as being cannibals and whatnot. But before we get to that, H.J. Evans said Islam has thousands of da'if hadith, but they're perfectly preserved. I wonder why they keep the da'if hadith.
Because they are authoritative. Because they are 100% authentic and authoritative. That's why. They can't get rid of them.
So a da'if hadith can be used as long as it doesn't directly contradict a sahih or Hasan hadith. They're thought, I think the percentage is 45 to 70% likely to be Muhammad's words. So they're
45 to 80%, I believe, is likely to be authentic, which is technically that would make it the same level of authenticity as a Hasan hadith. And also, there are many cases where one scholar grades it da'if and another scholar grades it sahih. So there's too many contradictions where you'll have scholars debating over this. And also, a da'if hadith with the words of the Prophet quoting Muhammad is considered authoritative.
Yeah. So don't think that these are fabricated. They're just things that they can't be certain that Muhammad said those exact words.
Yeah,
but generally,
they all say that. Sorry. No, they also say that the person retelling, the person stating that particular report may have told the truth in that instance. He may have been entirely authentic, so they cannot discount that. And there's a number of other factors that make these hadith authentic. So they cannot get rid of them because they have too high a probability of being entirely accurate.
Exactly. All right, so we're going to move on to the geographers. So these are the people who, in theory, right, in theory, are providing an objective description of people, that they're talking about, various different parts of the known world and describing the peoples living there. And in theory, they're just trying to give a straightforward interpretation. And we're going to see that they are reflecting the true thoughts. We've looked at things that, while they're clearly racist, they're not always explicit. Now we're going to see exactly where those racist ideas come from. So Kutayeb writes, blacks are ugly and misshapen because they live in a hot country. And that's going to be the friendliest thing that we see, I believe. Ibn al-Fakah al-Hamadani said, a man of discernment said, the people of Iraq do not come out with something between blonde, buff, and bleached coloring, such as the infants dropped from the wombs of the women of the Slavs, and others of similar light complexion. Nor are they overdone in the womb until they are burned, so that the child comes out something between black, murky, malodorous, stinking, and crinkly haired, and with uneven limbs, deficient minds, and depraved passions, such as the Zanj, the Somali, and other blacks who resemble them. The Iraqis are neither half-baked dough nor burned crust, but between the two. So he's saying, you can look at our skin, and we have the best color. He doesn't like the lighter complexion, but compared to how he describes the darker complexion, pretty kind words there about the Slavs, I would say.
Yeah.
What are your
Even
thoughts?
Al-Faqih means he's one of the ulama. He's one of the fuqaha. He's a man of knowledge. That would mean he's a trained jurist in the Sharia. So that's what that honorific means, Al-Faqih.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it's not very objective, right? To me, it might as well be lumped in with the things that we just read from the poets, and then from these figures who spewed this sort of stuff. Very little actual, just plain fact, and much conjecture, much of just this personal sentiment regarding different types of people. And as you said, even the white people, they seem to kind of look down upon in this sort of way. But all of this stuff about deficient minds, depraved passions, things which should have nothing to. And you talked about this, in the very beginning when we looked at the differences between, when you said, is race real? Yes and no, right? Yes, there are these real differences that are associated with people from certain regions and such. But it's wrong to say that these differences somehow equate to some sort of intellect or things of that nature. And yet that's exactly what we see here, right? He makes this quick but huge jump from going to talking about skin color, with even that being offensive in the way he describes it, even though he didn't say cattle this time, to then jumping all the way to deficient minds and depraved passions and things of that sort. And there we go. He uses the Zanj, the Somali, other blacks who resemble them, and that whole spectrum, it likely runs together very closely. So I'm sure in that statement he's probably referring to the whole of Africa, or at least most of it. So yeah, it's just it's sad how even the quote unquote objective, if this is objective, then God help us. So.
Yeah, he seems to think that white people don't spend enough time in the womb, so that they come out half-baked, and then black people spend too much time in the womb, so they come out burnt. Only people who look like him have the correct amount of time in the womb, and which, like you said, that's offensive enough, but then he goes on to equate that with intelligence. All right. We have just a few more slides for today. So we have al-Musudi. He says that Galen says that the merriment dominates the black man because of his defective brain, whence also the weakness of his intelligence. And Hudad al-Alam says, as regards southern countries, all their inhabitants are black on account of the heat of the climate. Most of them go naked. In all their lands and provinces, gold is found. They are people distant from the standards of humanity. There, referring to the Zanj, nature is that of wild animals. They are extremely black. Among themselves, here referring to the Sudanese, there are people who steal each other's children and sell them to the merchants when they later arrive. So first of all, we have al-Masudi. He attributes this words to Galen. They're not found otherwise in Galen's work, but that doesn't necessarily mean Galen didn't say them. But regardless of whether Galen said them first or not, he's clearly endorsing them, right? He's endorsing them, saying that Black people, they're joyful because they don't have very good minds. So they're just, ignorance is bliss, so to speak. And then we have al-Alam, who in theory is describing what he found. Obviously, he didn't actually travel there, but he's repeating rumors from people who did. And he's saying that all the people in the South, they just go naked. They're not humans. They act like animals. And hey, they'll even sell their own children for money. So what are your thoughts on, our esteemed intellects of the day? And to be clear, these are absolutely people who would have been seen as the highest intellects. They're well educated. They are literate. They're writing books in theory to inform other people about these objective facts, and this is what they're writing.
I've just got some notes that I discovered that the Zanj Rebellion led to a widespread diffusion of negative and unfavorable images of blacks in the Islamic world. And the revolt also distracted the Abbasid caliphates from other regions. And so it led to lots of negative propaganda against Black people in Islam. But also, I just read to you from Islamic law that states that if someone is a dhimmi, effectively a prisoner of war, their wife and children can be sold by a Muslim as recompense for that dhimmi not paying his poll tax. So I'm not sure where they want to take the moral high ground if they believe that it is their legal right to sell someone's wife and child or to enslave a family, which means they can then immediately separate the husband and wife because her marriage is annulled and he can then use that woman. So there's just too much of this. And I mean, when are Muslims going to start apologizing for this and owning up to this? This whole shaming is just in one direction. And I think, look, if it's good for the goose, it is good for the gander.
What do they say? Tit for tat, you shoot my dog, I'll kill your cat. I think I heard Anthony Rogers say that. Right? But yeah, I mean, you make an excellent point. I mean, they have no place to say these sort of things today, knowing that this is their history, knowing that this is what's been not only occurring, but propagated and supported, right? By, as Thaddeus said, the intellectuals of the day. Many that outside of this realm would have been regarded on so many other issues of Islam and of the world around them. And yet, this is what we see. When this is what we see, I think it goes hand in hand with what we've read from earlier. So not really surprising, but I mean, you both make excellent points for sure.
Yeah. One thing I might note, since we're talking about race, I mean, growing up in Africa, one thing I do note is that, and this is a failing in Black culture, in that in Black culture, you are Black. Okay, I'll speak for myself here so that I don't impugn all Black people. Black people don't take responsibility. They want to blame anyone and everyone else. And this is the same, shall we say, in non-Western culture. There's the concept of introspection. We look at what we've done wrong and we go, we did that. We are responsible for that, because Christians do not deny the fact of slavery in European culture. But you go to Black people and it's every conspiracy theory in the book to explain the white people did it, the Martians did it, the aliens caused it, Bigfoot did it, whatever, the Illuminati, George Soros, you name it, whether it's true or not. And I think this is an issue within the culture where we need to get people to start taking responsibility. And this is something that is missing within Islamic culture, and it's missing in Black culture. And Black culture needs to stop just conveniently blaming white people because, this whole guilt. I mean, this whole guilt, this needs to stop. That's just my thought on that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in a lot of ways that's the easy route, right? And a lot of Black people that tend to do that are also the ones that are going to be more likely than not to be swooned over by Islam, right? Because they don't look deeply at these things and realize that this is the real history of what's occurred. And I think you make a great point, because I mean, that's why we see that when often immigrants from Africa who come to the U.S., you know, they often perform very well. They often excel in their fields because they come from that sort of mentality where it's not as much about blaming others or any of these sort of things, but they have that introspection, and we see them do so much better in many of these different fields. So I think that's a very good point.
I
Sola
just want to blame.
Scriptura said something similar. He said, as blacks, we always blame the past and we don't want to move forward. That's my experience as a black African. So I know, Io, you wanted to go after about 2 hours. I have about 5, 6 more slides. So your call, whether you want to
Yeah,
continue.
we can just finish it off. Yeah.
All righty. And we're going to see a lot of repetition in these. So it may not take too long. Wait, what just happened? Did I accidentally go backwards?
Yeah.
All right. So Al-Makdisi says, describing the neighbors of the Buja, so this is going to be like Central Africa, there's no marriage among them. The child does not know his father. They eat people, but God knows best. As for the Zanj, they are people of black color, flat noses, kinky hair, and little understanding or intelligence.
South
Al-Baruni,
African government was vilified for saying literally word for word the same things. That was a crime against humanity. And if you're Muslim, it's okay. It'll be fine.
apparently. And keep in mind, he died in the year 991. So we're talking about the 10th century here, many years before the foundation of South African government. And the Zanj Al-Baruni says the Zanj are so uncivilized that they have no notion of a natural death. If a man dies a natural death, they think he is poisoned. Every death is suspicious with them. If a man has not been killed by a weapon. And Al-Idrisi says the black people have a lack of knowledge and deficient minds. Their kings only acquire what they know about government and justice from the instruction of learned visitors. So that last one there, I think, is they're all horrific. But the last one, he's saying whatever good they have, they get from visitors coming.
Mm-hmm.
You know, presumably the Arabs, when they come down there and they tell them, that's how they learn to have something sort of resembling civilization. Otherwise, they just run around like animals. They don't even know what death is because they're all killing each other. So they think that anytime someone dies, someone must have killed them. Very interesting material here. Any thoughts you want to add?
It's ironic because, this comes from the culture of jihad, which literally can only attribute its power from, spreading by the sword and such. And so on one hand, they do that. And then on the other hand, they look down on a people that also is very familiar with conflict or the sword, or however you want to characterize it. Not really much of a good vantage point to be standing from. Other than that, the rest of it seems pretty similar to what we've read. But the last one is particularly bad because it's basically just gatekeeping things in a way where it's like, hey, any good that you see come out of them, any good that you think spawns from this society, just know that it was us who came and enlightened them and provided them with X, Y, Z so that they might ascend and become better as a people. Nothing is ever that black and white. Nothing's ever that black and white, pun intended, I guess, but nothing's ever that cut and dry in history and in society. And so the fact that this is being said again by these intellectuals, by these supposed, heavyweights of culture and society at the time, says a lot.
All right. So early on, we saw how so-called scientists sought to justify the racism in European society. Here we have the same thing happening in the Muslim culture. We have Ibn Sina, also known as Avicenna, often touted as the father of modern medicine by Muslim propagandists. He certainly played some role in the development of European thought, but not nearly the role that they would try to give him. But let's just say that he was very important, and he was really the father of medicine. Well, it seems that he was also the father of scientific racism, because he states that black people are by their very nature slaves. And this is the number one most intellectual figure in Islamic history untold by Muslims. Any thoughts on that?
What do you say to that?
Yeah, actually,
Yeah, what do you say? You're genetically inclined to be slaves by having dark skin.
But that's why they
And
call them abid. I mean, that's why
Yep.
black people are called slaves. This is part and parcel of the way that they look at black skin, or the way that they looked at black skin.
And then we're going to conclude here with the view of blacks in heaven. We saw early on the Quran verse, and now we have one of many interpretations by important Muslim works that back up this being taken as skin color. This comes from the Epistle of Forgiveness. It's perhaps the most popular vision of heaven and hell in the medieval Islamic world. It's kind of the for some reason I'm drawing a blank. You probably know what I'm referring to. The equivalent of the description of hell in the medieval Christian world. I don't know why I'm drawing a blank. Anyway, so this work, it's an imaginative tale of heaven, and there's a couple main characters that are sheikhs, and they're traveling around, learning about what's happening in heaven. Or I really should say Jannah, because it's not anything to do with the biblical heaven. So the sheikh encounters a couple girls, and one of them begins to laugh uncontrollably. The sheikh asks why she's laughing, and she says, for joy. And then the other one says, do you know who I am? I'm Ali ibn Mansur. I am the black Tawfiq who used to work in the House of Learning in Baghdad in the time of Abd Mansur, Muhammad ibn Ali al-Khazan. I used to fetch the manuscripts for the copyists. And then the sheikh, in reply, learning that this was a black servant, let's say, and not really like what we'd associate with a slave, but someone in a servant role to a learned Muslim, he exclaims, there's no God but God. You're black, and now you're more dazzling white than camphor, which if you don't know what that is, which I didn't, so if you don't know what that is, just look it up. It's extremely white flour and produces an extremely white chemical. Do you find that odd? Replies the girl. After all, the poets say of some mortal being, one mustard seed of light from him, with all black people mixed, would whiten all the blacks. So the black girl goes to heaven. She is turned into a glowing white figure, almost translucent like the houris. And she says, why are you surprised? This is what Allah can do. All he has to do is take a small amount of light and he mixes it with the black people, and then they're no longer black. What are your thoughts on this description of paradise?
Being black is obviously a disability that needs to be cured in Islamic thought.
Yeah, he praises God for it, right? He praises God. I mean, that's the crazy part. It's not just this neutral thing. I mean, it's like thank God that you've been made white. And what does that say about Allah? What does that say about Islam as a whole? I mean, wow.
Yeah. They don't judge you by the content of your character. You're judged by the color of your skin.
Mm-hmm.
Muhammad was a leftist. He was a Democrat.
I think it's safe to say that they won't be celebrating MLK Day on Monday.
Yeah, probably not. In Jannah, there's no celebration of MLK Day. Speaking of which, I'll have a video out. I said as a start, but most of you weren't here, so I'll have a video out looking at this, the related Quran verse, this passage from the Epistle of Forgiveness, and various other Muslim texts, contrasting them with Yasser Qadi, who claims that there's no possible way to read this as being skin color. So be on the lookout for that. And I want to end with this note. So we looked at a whole bunch of geographers, and we saw that they all were, had these very racist attitudes. They were describing the people of Central and Southern Africa as being animals, eating one another, selling their children, so on and so forth. We do have a rare work here by Jamal al-Din, etc., al-Jazari, who wrote a work called The Lightning of the Darkness on the Merits of the Blacks and the Ethiopians, which was an attempt to defend Black people against the prevailing culture. And I point this out because, well, one, we don't want to be racist ourselves and say that every single Muslim, every single Arab thought of themselves as superior. But two, the fact that he had to write this work just shows how prevalent this thought was and how much he was fighting against the prevailing culture. He writes that I have seen a number of outstanding Ethiopians whose hearts were breaking because of their Black color. So I let them know that respect is based on the performance of good deeds and not on beautiful forms. I therefore composed for them this book, which deals with a good number of Ethiopians and Blacks. So he has people who are, let's just say friends. I don't know their exact relationship, but he has people he's friendly with, who are from Ethiopia, who have dark skin, and he's seeing that they're decent people, but they're being told they're not. They're being told that because they have dark skin, they're inferior, they're not good Muslims, and he feels for them because their hearts are breaking, and he tries to defend them. And I want to say good job to him, but at the same time, the prevailing thought came from the words of Muhammad. How much better would it have been for him to turn to the words of Jesus, the words of the New Testament, who says that we all have the same standing before God?
Amen.
Any last thoughts from either of you?
I think that was excellent. I think that, of course, we can't paint everyone with a broad brush, but at the same time, we can't ignore the impact theologically that Islam has had in its views, in people's views on race, both within that region as well as the regions that it's spread to. And so it's a shame that many people during this time and during these centuries were subjected to these sort of things. But the most or the least that we can do to try and give them some sort of justice is be honest about the origin of such sort of thinking, and not be afraid to call it out when we see it and acknowledge it for what it is, as many today are afraid to do, because it's by doing so that we can then see more of what we see here from Jamal, in encouraging people not to look at the outward but the inward, which is what I think we should all strive for. So
excellent. So we had a couple Muslims in the chat earlier. I don't think that they stuck around, but if there are any Muslims, so Ultimate Truth, he went through like 5 different usernames trying to fool us into thinking that he was a different person. It didn't work. Agas is a decent guy. I would have liked to discuss this with him, but I think he left pretty quickly when he realized that we were just looking at the primary sources and he couldn't argue his way out of what they said. Either he doesn't care what they say because he says, I only care what the Quran says, or he just didn't want to be embarrassed.
Well, look, it's blasphemy. It's blasphemy for a Muslim to believe that Islam is less than perfect. None of them can acknowledge facts from Islam, even if it's directly out of their primary sources. It's blasphemy, right? So they will be punished. They could be put to death. They will be hurt. They will be ostracized by family. They could lose their jobs, whatever social status. So Islam has insulated itself from criticism by its own members, even if it's true. I mean, there's multiple layers of this. And it's very, very sad. For myself, I mean, once we have these facts, we need to also start pushing back hard, because the kind of negativity focused on Western culture, which is the greatest culture, the most fair culture that has uplifted more people than any other culture in history. This kind of attack is destroying Western culture. It is damaging, and it is taking civilization backwards, I believe. And we need to be able to push back with the facts, and we need to hit back as hard as they hit back. I mean, this is warfare for them. And they're using shame. Well, they're lying. First of all, they are lying about our culture, and two, we are honest about the failings of the culture and the mistakes, and we learn. Whereas they take those admissions as weaknesses and they just amp up the propaganda and the deceit. We are simply speaking the truth. We need to use this, and if it shames them, too bad. It's the facts, and we need to stop giving ground. We need to stop ceding ground. We have the truth. We have provably the best civilization, the best moral system ever, the best legal system, and we need to push back hard, because I don't want to go back and live in a third world culture.
Very well said.
Carmel says this is Satan's agenda to pit humanity against one another. Hate and division. Indifference is the opposite of love. And we'll probably do a part 3. So far, we've looked at Islam's treatment of specifically Black people. However, there's a separate but related root in Islam teaching the superiority of Arabs over all other people. And so since I titled this, specifically on racism and how it relates to the American problem, if you will, of race, I wanted to focus on Islam's view of specifically people from Africa. However, the roots run deep, that the Muslim is taught today, even if they're not taught what we would call explicitly racist thoughts, they're taught that the Muslim is superior to everyone else, that the Arabs are the most superior of the Muslims, and then of course Muhammad's own tribe was the most best of the Arabs, and then Muhammad's the best of his tribe. So it's built right into the roots of Islam, this feeling of superiority. And in my experience, most Muslims I've talked to, not necessarily from America or Europe, who grew up in the West, but most Muslims who grew up in Muslim worlds, their primary confidence in Islam is based on the inferiority of non-Muslims, especially Christians. It has very little to do with anything that the religion teaches. Well, I guess the religion teaches that, but anything we'd consider religious teaching, it's more based on, I have pride that I am superior to the non-Muslim. So I can't even consider the truth of another religion, because to do so would make myself utterly rejected by society, the worst of people, subhuman even. And non-Muslims are a different class of creatures. And the comment I had up there is absolutely correct, that this comes from Satan. Satan doesn't really care what you believe as long as it's not the gospel, as long as it's not the saving truth of Christianity. So he'll sow discord wherever he can. He'll use things like our difference in appearance. He'll promote that. He's happy to promote, racial equality as well, as long as it doesn't lead to the gospel. And in the Muslim world, it's all about feeling superior to non-Muslims, because that provides a very strong protection against leaving the satanic cult of Islam.
Well said. Well said.
Alrighty, I did not see any Muslims. Just scanning really quick, I don't see any Muslims in the chat, so we're going to go ahead and close it here, because Io has other things that he needs to get done today. I'm sure Lloyd is probably anxious to wrap up his evening, because it's getting late where he is. So thank you all for joining us today. Again, be on the lookout for my video Monday talking about the Islamic view of heaven, and how all the early Muslim exegetes, the very best, right down to Al-Qurtubi, the best Muslim exegete of all time, saw this as a literal description of skin color. So thank you for joining us today. Have a great week. Go and use this material in your discussion with Muslims, and don't allow society to continue to push this narrative that Christianity is the source of racism. God bless. Have a great day.
God bless all. Thank you. Goodbye.